Hey there, listeners. Are you ready to elevate your energy game? Let me introduce you to Dubby, the energy drink brand on a mission to help you be better. Dubby is designed to give you the boost you need without the jitters or crashes that accompany many of the drinks supplied by Big Energy. Their drinks are sugar-free, calorie-free, and free from artificial colors or dyes. They launched with just one flavor, but thanks to the support of their loyal customers, they've grown to offer over 15 unique custom-made flavors. So if you're looking for a clean, delicious energy boost that helps you power through your day, look no further than Dubby. Join the movement and experience the difference for yourself. Visit WGG and use the code WW1POD for a 10% discount on your order. Remember, with Dubby, it's all about being better, one sip at a time. Alright, bills are paid. Let's get on with the show. I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, Silent Wind. The interior of the sealed room beyond the glass had been enveloped by a yellow-green cloud. He started as a fist abruptly erupted from within the mist, slamming against the glass that separated them from the poor soul inside. Ludwig Richter stood passively taking in the sight. He glanced over at his fellow chemist, Dieter Krauss, who watched the scene with a complex expression. Dieter's eyes gleamed with a mix of pride and disturbance. His jaw clenched tightly and a tense smile played on his lips. Turning his head back to the gas-filled room, Ludwig remarked, "This changes everything." A voice from behind him boomed, "Yes, it does, my boy. You men have just won the war for Germany." The voice itself was attached to a short, balding man named Rolf Hahn, a German colonel who had been tasked with overseeing the work of the chemists and engineers. "After today, people will learn to fear the German Empire." Ludwig heard Dieter, still standing stoically next to him. "Fear is right, and with fear comes respect." Ludwig turned his attention to the project lead, Fritz Haber, who had watched the events unfold from another corner of the closet-sized room. Haber's face was unreadable. Still, Ludwig proudly proclaimed, "We did it, boss. We really did it." Fritz Haber was a renowned chemist in Germany. He had been half of the team that made it possible to produce ammonia on an industrial scale, which was crucial to the production of fertilizers. The Haber-Bosch process, as it came to be called, had a tremendous impact on agriculture, allowing for the increased production of food and helping to sustain a growing global population. Now, however, with the world at war, he had been tasked with something much different than anything he had ever done: creating a chemical weapon that could very well win the war. Ludwig awaited Haber's response. He did not get one, as Haber quietly and stoically walked out of the room. Colonel Hahn turned to follow. "That man is too proud for his own good. He doesn't even want to take credit for the great thing he's done. Germany should have hundreds more like him." Dieter stood peering into the adjacent room through the large observation window. "That was quite the ordeal." "For him," he exclaimed, letting out a hearty guffaw. He then turned and walked out the door, leaving Ludwig alone in the room, the door closing with a soft click behind him. He could hear the ventilation system kick on and watched as the yellow-green cloud slowly dissipated. It took an hour before he could clearly see through the window and into the room. The man, a man he only knew as prisoner 761587, lay on the floor. His white skin had turned a hue of green. His hands were wrapped around his own throat, and there were scratches all over his chest and face. Ludwig guessed that the man suffered a great deal before his demise. A door opened on the other side of the affected room, and two men entered. They wore lab coats like his, gloves, and custom masks that were intended to filter the air as they breathed. The two men shuffled across the room to the body, one grabbing the arms and the other grabbing his feet. They lifted the man and walked out. Ludwig felt accomplished. They had completed what they had been tasked to do, and their accomplishment could change the tide of the war. The German army had become entrenched near a small Belgian village called Ypres. The government and military desperately wanted a way to break the stalemate there. Chemical warfare seemed to be the logical course of action. Fritz Haber had been tasked with the job. Ludwig and Dieter were just two of the chemists along for the ride. And tonight, the three of them would get together for dinner at the Haber household. Ludwig had arrived just after sundown to the Haber home, which was located in Dahlem, a suburb of Berlin. His invitation came with strict instructions. No talk of work, and especially of that morning's human testing. Fritz's wife, Clara Immerwahr, was a staunch pacifist and strongly disagreed with the premise of their work. She, being a highly decorated chemist herself, had prioritized the role of wife over her work as society demanded, but that did not mean she would abandon her opinions. And tonight, in her presence, any mention of their work would elicit a strong response from her. As Ludwig approached the front door, he took in the elegant facade of the house illuminated by the soft glow of gas lamps. He smoothed his coat and adjusted his tie, trying to shake off the unsettling images from the lab. Tonight was meant to be a respite, though he doubted it would be entirely free of tension. Clara greeted him at the door with a polite, if somewhat strained, smile. "Welcome, Ludwig. Please, come in." "Thank you, Frau Immerwahr," Ludwig replied, stepping into the warmly lit foyer. The house was tastefully decorated, with framed photographs and bookshelves lining the walls, reflecting both the intellectual pursuits and domestic life of its inhabitants. He was admiring a painting when Fritz appeared from the dining room, extending a hand. "Ludwig, glad you could join us. Dieter has just arrived as well. Let's head to the dining room." The dining room was intimate, with a round table set for four. Candles flickered in the center, casting a gentle glow over the polished silverware and fine china. Dieter was already seated, a glass in hand. As they took their seats, Clara's eyes flickered with a mix of warmth and guardedness. "I hope you enjoy the meal. It's a simple fare, but I believe good food and good company are the best remedies for a weary mind." "Indeed," Ludwig said, lifting his glass, "to good food and good company." The first course was served, a delicate soup that warmed the chill of the evening. Conversation flowed, carefully steered away from the lab. Clara spoke passionately about her recent readings and the importance of humanitarian efforts, her voice carrying a quiet strength. Fritz, ever the gracious host, nodded in agreement, but occasionally cast a glance at Ludwig and Dieter, a silent reminder of the unspoken pact for the evening. After 3 courses and much polite conversation, none of it touching on the war or their work, Clara rose to serve an after-dinner drink. There was a knock at the front door, and Ludwig watched Clara as her face turned from concentrating on her current task to confusion. "We weren't expecting anyone else, were we, love?" she asked Fritz. Fritz, looking just as confused, rose to answer the door. "We were not." "I will get the tea while you see who it is, love," she politely ordered. After a few moments, Ludwig could hear the voices from the other room. He looked over at Dieter, who shrugged his shoulders. They both seemed to gain recognition of the second voice at the same time, for their eyes widened. "Colonel Hahn?" He looked again at Dieter. "What is he doing here?" They were unable to mask their confusion as Clara re-entered the room with a platter of drinks. She noticed instantly. "What is it?" She started as Fritz walked in with Colonel Hahn, who was just as boisterous now as he was earlier in the day, before, during, and after their highly successful human trial. "Clara!" His voice rose above the uncomfortable silence in the room. Ludwig looked on as Clara put the drinks down on the table and braced herself for the hug she was about to receive. After a brief embrace and a kiss on the cheek, Han turned his focus to the platter of drinks. "May I?" he asked as he pointed to the 4 glasses. Clara's uncomfortability was apparent to all but Han, for they all knew that she despised the Colonel and everything he stood for. Ludwig looked at Fritz, who seemed to be in some state of shock. "By all means, Colonel, please have a drink with us." Fritz's voice was calm and collected, which didn't seem to match the look on his face. At least to Ludwig it didn't. Han made himself comfortable at the table. Fritz sat down in his seat and shifted uncomfortably. Clara stood by the table, next to her husband. "What were we talking about?" asked Han in his usual blustery way. It was Dieter who spoke next. "We were discussing Miss Emoir's doctorate in chemistry. Did you know that she is the very first woman in Germany to achieve that? It's quite the accomplishment." Ludwig was grateful for Dieter's quick thinking, and by the looks on their faces, both Fritz and Clara seemed to feel the same. "She gave lectures," Ludwig added with fervor. Han was uninterested, but focused on Clara just the same. "Breslau University, yes, I know, but you're married now, so none of that matters. Is this correct, Miss Emoir?" Clara sighed heavily. Even Ludwig knew that she resented how society placed married women in the home. "I guess you're right, Colonel." Han clasped his hands together in satisfaction. "So, shall we talk of more important things?" "Here it comes," Ludwig thought to himself. Fritz set his glass on the table and shot the Colonel a look that Ludwig saw as a tread lightly look. "What is it you would like to discuss, Colonel?" Han did not get the hint. "Well, today, obviously." He turned his attention directly to Clara again. "Miss Emoir, it's a travesty that you did not take your husband's name. I should be calling you Mrs. Haber. But that really is of no consequence. Do you know what your husband and these men accomplished today?" "Colonel, it's nothing we need to discuss here. This is just a few friends getting together for dinner," Fritz interjected. He was attempting to steer the conversation from ground that was dangerous to his marriage, Ludwig could tell. Han was oblivious to Haber's attempts. "Nonsense! This is a day to celebrate." Clara seemed interested, if not somewhat amused. "Yes, please go ahead, Colonel. Tell me everything." She then shot a cold look at her husband. She knows him really well, Ludwig thought to himself. "Today, Mrs. Haber." All pretenses of politeness towards her choice of keeping her maiden name had gone out the window now. "These men made a breakthrough. They created something that will most certainly win the war for Germany, cementing our place on the world stage as a nation to be feared, to be respected." Standing now with her arms folded, Clara asked, "And what, my dear Colonel, is that?" He took a sip of his drink and raised the glass. "These men conducted the first human trials of a chlorine gas that, when unleashed on the unsuspecting French and British forces, will undoubtedly cause their nations to surrender and call for peace." Clara was unable to mask how horrified she was at this revelation. She looked directly at her husband. "You tested on a human?" It was the Colonel who answered. "He was a criminal. He is of no consequence. What's important is what these men have done for the fatherland." "You must excuse me, Colonel. I'm pretty tired." And Clara walked out of the room, her face a mask of disappointment and anger. Ludwig glanced at Fritz. He looked dejected, defeated. "Colonel, I appreciate your enthusiasm for our work, but this was not the time or place to celebrate it," Fritz said quietly. Han ignored him and powered on. "Our engineers have already begun testing canisters to use to deliver the weapon. In 2 weeks, we will end the stalemate in Belgium." Dieter spoke next. "Well, I hope it goes well. You will be sure to tell us, won't you?" Han laughed. "No, you and young Ludwig here are going, my boy. You get to see it firsthand. Fritz will stay here to continue his work." And with that, he raised his glass. To Germany. Ludwig raised his glass to meet Hans, as did Dieter. A few moments later, Fritz raised his as well. Ludwig felt utterly miserable in this cold, muddy place. How could anyone endure such conditions? These thoughts plagued him as he sat in the relative comfort of a large tent erected specifically for the chemists, just a mile from the front lines. The tent had a wooden frame and a canvas cover, furnished with 2 single beds and chests for their belongings. He could only imagine the hardships faced by the men at the front. They had been here for 3 days working closely with the team of engineers, and Ludwig was surprised to learn that over 6,000 canisters had been manufactured and filled with the lethal gas they had developed. Today, however, was the day that the weather and wind conditions would allow them to deploy the weapon. In an hour, Dieter and he would accompany the military to the front line to witness the deployment of this monster that they helped create. Ludwig's heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread. He and Dieter often spoke of the implications of using such a thing, their conversations tinged with a sense of foreboding. When the trucks were loaded, they were summoned to embark on the 1-mile journey to the front lines. Dieter had a determined look on his face as they walked to the trucks, and as he loaded into one, he looked at Ludwig. "For Germany." Ludwig smiled. "For Germany," and he climbed in after him. The sound of artillery and gunfire grew louder as they approached the front lines. The first thing Ludwig saw as he disembarked from the back of the truck was a grim tableau. Bodies scattered across the ground, some lying wounded waiting for transport to a medical tent, while others would most likely be buried close to where they fell. The sight of the carnage steeled his resolve. "Today we end this," he muttered to himself, a little louder than intended. Dieter sidled up beside him, his expression resolute. "Damn right. Today, Germany wins." A wave of nationalistic pride surged within Ludwig, a feeling he had always suppressed, but now felt exposed and raw. He glanced into the distance, where he believed the French and British lines lay hidden in the haze of smoke. "Today, they pay for this," he snarled. Soon they were led into the trench system that snaked through the battlefield like a gnarled vein, a network of muddy channels carved into the earth to shield the troops from enemy fire. However, the reality was far from the intended protection. The trenches were often little more than stagnant pools of murky water, teeming with vermin and insects. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a foul mix of rotting flesh and damp earth, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder that clung to their uniforms like a second skin. As they descended deeper into the trench, they noticed the faces of weary soldiers who huddled together, their expressions a blend of fear and resignation. The sound of distant artillery echoed above, a constant reminder of the chaos that lay just beyond the fragile walls. They were soon ushered into a dugout within the trench system, a larger chamber that had been excavated to serve as a command post for high-level meetings. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the smell of sweat and the oppressive atmosphere of anxiety. A long wooden table dominated the room, its surface cluttered with maps and marked with the ink of countless strategies and plans. High-ranking military officials stood around the table, their uniforms crisp and adorned with medals that glinted in the dim light. But no one took a seat. The tension in the air was thick, a silent acknowledgment of the gravity of their mission. Ludwig and Dieter were introduced to a whirlwind of faces, too many to remember in the chaos of the moment. Officers of various ranks exchanged curt nods, their voices low and urgent as they discussed the impending operation. Engineers, their hands stained with dirt and grease, moved purposely around the room, overseeing the setup of the gas canisters that would soon be deployed. As chemists brought in to witness the event, Ludwig and Dieter found themselves on the periphery of this tense gathering. Very few people acknowledged their presence, and the conversations swirled around them like the smoke of distant artillery. They exchanged glances, feeling the weight of their silence in a room charged with urgency. While others strategized and prepared for the grim task ahead, they sat quietly, absorbing the gravity of their moment, acutely aware of their role as mere spectators of this organized chaos. Then it was time. The engineers were confident in the wind strength and direction. According to their calculations, there was no risk of the gas drifting back towards them or veering off course. They were provided with cloths that they and others soaked in water and wrapped around their mouths and noses, a precaution they all hoped would prove unnecessary. Then they waited. Ludwig elbowed Dieter and pointed towards the opening of the dugout. "Look!" From their vantage point, they could see an engineer opening a canister, a wet rag wrapped around his face for protection. The canister appeared much smaller compared to the vastness of the trench. As the engineer released the valve, a thick yellow-green gas surged out rapidly from its pressurized confines. He glanced over at Dieter, who seemed to be mesmerized by the sight. "And there it goes, their comeuppance." Dieter nodded his head slowly in agreement. For Germany and victory. 3 hours later, they were rattling along in the back of a transport truck headed back to the German military base of operations. Ludwig, along with everyone in the vehicle, was jubilant. By all initial reports, which came in rapidly, the deployment had been a massive success. They had learned that the targeted section of the line was held by the British, who had suffered approximately 5,000 to 6,000 casualties. The celebrations were jubilant that evening. Everyone was positive that the British would capitulate at any moment. Ludwig was just as excited, but opted to forego any festivities. He was tired, and the adrenaline from earlier in the day took a lot out of him. As a result, he slept soundly. It had been 2 days since the chemicals were deployed, and still Ludwig and Dieter were a mile from the front lines. There was to be another deployment as soon as the winds permitted. Ludwig awoke to Dieter already awake, dressed, and waiting for him. Dieter seemed excited. "About time. Come on, get dressed." Ludwig rubbed his eyes. "Dressed for what?" Dieter crossed the room and grabbed Ludwig's pants, which had been lying on the floor. He tossed them onto the bed. "The guys last night were telling me of a little town called Verlorenheim, about 3 miles north of here. It has a little diner with great crepes. I've never had a crepe, have you?" Ludwig sat up in his bed. "I cannot say that I have. I wouldn't say no to trying one, though." He retrieved the pants and proceeded to put them on. The small cafe occupied the ground floor of a 2-story wooden home, its weathered exterior hinting at years of history. Above the entrance, a hand-painted sign swayed gently in the breeze, inviting passersby to step inside. A narrow balcony extended from the cafe, featuring 2 petite wrought iron tables, each perfect for 2 people. Brightly colored flowers in small pots added a cheerful touch, making it an ideal spot for enjoying a coffee while watching the village life unfold. Inside, the dining room was cozy and compact, with just enough space for 4 sturdy wooden tables, each seating 4. The walls were adorned with local artwork, and the warm glow of gas lamps created an inviting atmosphere. The air was filled with the enticing aromas of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. Ludwig and Dieter sat at a table next to a window. From the window they could see some small homes, fruit and vegetable carts, and other businesses that adorned the main road through the small village. They could see people mulling about, going about their daily lives, even though they could hear the distant cacophony of battle that raged on a mere 3 miles away. Dieter spoke with a mouthful of strawberry crepe. "This is heavenly. If I weren't a chemist, I would open a place that sold crepes in Berlin." Ludwig chuckled at the thought. "These are good, but let's be honest. You, running a restaurant? No way." Dieter put his fork down. "I could do it. Maybe I just will." "Did you know that they deemed the winds favorable today?" This took Ludwig by surprise. "They did? And they don't want us there?" "Nah, they figured we saw what we needed. We're just here now because they don't want to send a transport back to Berlin with just 2 of us. I like this place." Dieter pointed out the window as he said this. "It's nice." Ludwig looked out the window again. There he saw a pack of 6 children kicking a ball around. To him, it seemed like they were playing football. It's amazing that a place like this can exist just a few miles from a raging battle. But I'd live here if I could. It is nice. He looked up to see Dieter's eyes widen. His face became ashen. Dieter, what's wrong? He noticed that Dieter had been looking over his shoulder through the glass doorway to the diner. He, in turn, looked back over his shoulder. A knot formed in his stomach. Both he and Dieter instinctively stood and walked towards the door. There, from inside the diner, they watched as the yellow-green cloud advanced towards and into the village. Speechless, they observed the cloud enveloping the main street. The villagers, who had moments before been blissfully aware of the impending threat, suddenly began to cough and choke, their faces turning a sickly shade of green as they fought for air. Panic erupted as some tried to flee, their instincts driving them to run. But in their frantic escape, they inhaled deeper breaths, drawing in larger doses of the poisonous cloud. Ludwig felt a surge of desperation as he watched the chaos unfold. People stumbled and fell, clutching their throats, their eyes wide with terror. The once bustling street, filled with laughter and life, had transformed into a scene of horror. He turned to Dieter, whose dreadful expression mirrored his own. It was then that he looked up and saw that through the cracks above the door, the green-yellow cloud was coming into the diner. Unlike the village, he knew what was coming. A note to the listener. This is the first time I have concluded the show with a historical note, and I may incorporate more in the future. I want to share with you a significant and tragic consequence of the first chemical attack, which occurred during the Second Battle of Ypres on April 22, 1915. Both Clara Immerwahr and Fritz Haber were real, although the dinner scene in my story is fiction. Clara was devastated by the news of the first chemical attack and took her own life 10 days later on May 2, 1915, using her husband's pistol. Fritz traveled to the Eastern Front to oversee the first deployment of gas against Russian troops 6 months later. This has been World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the show wherever you find this podcast, and don't forget to throw us a comment and a rating. We are on Facebook. Just search and like the official World War I Stories page. You can also join me on Blue Sky, where I go by the handle WW1Stories_HennyB. World War I Stories is now featured on Rabbit in Red Radio, with new episodes streaming Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. They also have all episodes available on demand. Visit Rabbit in Red Radio for this and many other independent podcasts. And last but not least, would you like your name read on the show? Become a producer by contributing to our Patreon at patreon.com/World War I Stories. I'm very grateful to everyone who downloads and listens to this show. I'm Henny B, and see you next time on World War I Stories.